Hello, this is Heather Hoffman, and today I have a couple cards to share with you using Pinkfresh Studio's Liquid Watercolors for a wet-on-wet technique. I'm using a couple of dies or coordinating dies as a negative stencil to create the wet-on-wet area that we're going to work with. So I'm starting off with one of the new release Lovely Frames die. I've already die cut it from just plain heavyweight white cardstock. I'm going to pop out the main frame bits. Now make sure and save those because now you can stamp sentiments on them and use them for other things. And I left the little extra pieces in there that aren't a specific frame shape. Now I want to hold my watercolor cardstock in place because I'm going to be using lots of water and it's going to tend to want to curl up. I can't use the tape on the front, first of all, because my frame goes too far to the edges, but I found creating a roll of it and placing it on the back does a really good job of holding it at least flat enough for what I need to do. So then I don't have to worry about it destroying anything on the front of my cardstock either, because once it dries, it comes off fairly easily. Now I set that frame die cut in place, and I kept the negative around the outside just to kind of help cover up so I don't get any water there as well. And I'm going to add a good coat of water. I played with a few others. I'll show you a little further on in the video. But I found a fairly heavy coat. You don't want so much water that it runs underneath, but you want it to be wet enough to flood like this. So you can see I just have a brush and all I'm doing is dotting in the color and it's just going to flow right into those wet frame pieces. And you can kind of see where they are. If you look a little from the side, you can see where the water is and where each of those frame pieces fit. I'm starting off with sky blue liquid watercolor, and then I'm going to come in and add a little more color using lavender. And you notice I'm just kind of dotting it in there and letting it flow on its own. If it seems like it's a little bit too dry and it's not moving like I want, I can add just a tiny bit more water to keep it flowing. Those top two frame pieces, I think a little later on I did add a dab more water to help them blend. But look how beautifully they flow. It almost gives kind of a marbly effect. And now that I've finished that, I'm coming in with just a teensy tiny bit of Sapphire liquid watercolor. I went nice and gentle on the application of this because this is a fairly dark color. So I just barely dip my brush in. I'm using a damp cloth to kind of clean off any excess. And there's where I'm coming in with just a tiny bit more water to kind of thin that down a little and adding a bit more lavender around the edges. And then I'm going to set that aside to dry nice and thoroughly. As I pick it up, you can kind of see how there's kind of the water, how it kind of flows as you tip it. So that's going to take a good while to dry. While that dries, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my Sweet Lemonade. Just the coordinating dies is all I need for what I'm going to do here. I'm going to follow the same technique with my watercolor cardstock. Make a loop of, this is just blue painter's tape from the hardware store. We had some in our garage and I found it worked really well for this to hold it in place. And I've die cut just the negative for the main cup and I'm going to use that as my stencil. The two colors I'm using for this is the sky blue again and a little bit of color from Aquamarine for a little bit of a deep shadow. Now all I'm doing on this, again, it's probably hard to tell in the video, but I'm not really working the color, moving it. All I'm doing is just dabbing it in and letting the water carry it around and let it flow. And then come in with the Aquamarine just around the edges so that it can kind of blend in with the other color. And that's going to add some of the depth and the shading, but in a very natural kind of way. As you tip it up, you can look and see how you tip it and it flows. So feel free to angle it and get the color moving kind of where you want. Some of it almost felt like there was too much, so I dried my brush off and kind of used it to soak up a little bit of the excess water and dried it off on my cloth. And then I kind of blended that water around again just to kind of get an even coat. Then came in with a tiny bit more of the Aquamarine to add some more of my shadows. And then same as the other one. Oh, and I had a little drop off to the side, so a little bit of clean water and you can easily clean up any little mistakes or drips. Now I'm going to show you some of my sample ones that I practice on. This first one is the same colors I used for the other card I showed you. This one I used Key Lime, Aquamarine, and Emerald City. This one I had a little drier. You might notice the colors are a little more sharp. And then this one was Bubblegum, Clementine, and Candy Apple. And this one I had the extra little punch out spots out. And then the top of it was drier than the bottom. So you can see the difference on the color, how it blends together more when there's more water and a little bit less where there wasn't. You got a little more of a dappled effect, I guess. and the wetter they were, the more they kind of marbled together. Now, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with these. Those were just kind of my test runs, and I couldn't leave them alone and not use them. So I went ahead and laid my Fancy Frames die back over and die cut all those pieces. Die cut them again from black, and then pieced all of them together kind of in a mosaic effect. And just because I couldn't even waste the negatives, I layered all those together, trimmed a little off the edges, and used that to create one card as well. So it's kind of just a fun little bonus few cards there, using some of my leftovers. All right, now that those have thoroughly dried, and that took a good long while. I gave it lots of time to make sure it was nice and dry, because I didn't want to try and adhere my frame onto a wet panel of cardstock. And you can see there too how it's fairly flat as well. That painter's tape did a really good job of holding it in place until it dried. So I didn't end up with a really curled and bowed piece of watercolor paper, which was kind of nice as well. Now you can use a glue pen or whatever kind of adhesive you want to adhere this. Since I'm adhering it onto watercolor cardstock, I wanted to use some liquid, some good sturdy liquid adhesive. This is a Gina K glue, a small little glue bottle, and I'm just adding a little tiny bit, and then I'm going to lay that over the top. I wanted to use gold cardstock for this, but I went to do it and realized my gold glitters cardstock, I didn't have any pieces large enough left for that. So I'm weighing that down with a couple of just clear stamp blocks, and while that dries in place, I'm going to go ahead and add my sentiment to my Sweet Lemonade cards. I do have 2 of these because the first video that I filmed, my camera didn't work, so I had to redo it, so I ended up with 2 of them, and I've already stamped my sentiment on one of them. I'm going to use Scripted Bold Sentiments. This one I'm using Scripted Bold Sentiments 1. The other sentiment was from Scripted Bold Sentiments 2, and then a little add-on sentiment from My Favorite Things to Say. And I'm lining it up over the bottle, and then I'm going to use my Misty to be able to stamp those in place, using black VersaFine ink, which is great for watercolor paper and getting good bold black sentiments. Once I stamped that small sentiment, I was happy with that. So I pulled that off, and I wanted to stamp that large one more time just to get a super dark, bold image on that. So I went ahead and stamped that one, but I didn't want to add any more color to the little one since it stamped great the first time. So I've cleaned those stamps off. I'm going to set that out of the way with my other sentiments. And now that I have both of those done, I decided I wanted to add some splatters to help accentuate the watercolor effect. I think splatters are just such a great way to really bring out the effect of watercolors. So I'm going to use the same 2 colors I used for the bottle, Sky Blue and Aquamarine, and also add a few extra splatters with Licorice watercolor, one of my favorites for just adding black splatters. And I found my favorite way is to use a really tiny, fine paintbrush. This one's a fairly slender and thin one. And I just pick up a little bit of the color, and you can kind of play with it to find out how much you need, if you want more or less. And then just tap it against your hand, tap the top of it with your finger, play with it and see what your favorite way to do it is. And I also use a box to protect my work surface because nothing makes a mess quicker than adding splatters to things I found. And then it's so hard to find them all over your desk and not smudge them on the next white card base that you don't want to get them on. Now this one, as I added the splatters, one of the parts I got to, my brush was a little wetter. So the other one had more fine, tiny splatters. This one, the little bit of water on there added a couple of larger and slightly softer colored splatters. So again, it's kind of fun to play with different techniques and different styles of adding the splatters and find the ones that you like the best. Now that those are done, once again, I'm going to set those aside to dry thoroughly. All these watercolor, you can speed up the drying with a heat gun, but I really prefer the effect of just letting them air dry on their own. All right, now we're going to add, I thought about a stamp sentiment on this, and then I decided just to add a sticker embellishment. This is from Everyday Musings layered stickers, and I picked one of those little stickers. They do have foam sticky adhesive on the back. Because this is popped up so far, and you put a card in and out of an envelope, I decided to add just a little bit of adhesive to the back of that. Unlike a scrapbook page that's going to stay in a sleeve protector, that might be popping in and out of an envelope. So I didn't want the sticker to peel off in a hurry. So that extra little bit of glue is going to just hold it in place a little bit better. Now, just like the other one, I have 2 of these as well. This one has a little bolder color, you might notice. I used a little more of the Sapphire in that one, and that came out a little bit of a bolder effect. But there's the 2 of those together. both with the fancy frames. And then there's these two. I added a black line around the outside edges on this one after the video using a ruler and a black marker. Thanks so much for coming by today. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you have a wonderful day.